It's time for some Awoo! And nobody's getting fined for it. That's right, on today's journey, I'm going to be painting a werewolf. Now, what's the best way for creatures that stalk the shadows to stalk the shadows? Why, to have black fur, of course. And that's what I'm going to be doing. For this, I'm using the finest brush I have, a Green Stuff World Gold Zero. On my palette, I'm mixing up the black and white in order to make the gray that I want. But I do mix in a little bit of orange just to give it a slight tint of brown, and mix out all my shades. To start off, I'm putting a lighter gray shade over the black base coat, just a thin layer. And I'm doing this because later when I do the fur pattern that I'm going to be painting on, I do want to go backwards a bit and shade into black, but have that fur pattern underneath it. In order to do that, I need to have a lighter gray on top, otherwise that black's not going to show up on black. This layer will also help guide me because I only put this in the highlights, so this will show me where, when I'm painting the fur, the highlights need to go as well. For this video, I'll be focusing on his right leg here, so we can see the whole process from start to finish on the same part. For the first layer of fur, I'm thinning down my neck shade quite a bit because I want it to be very loose coming off my brush, and in order to do that, it needs to be wet because it's a very fine brush. And to make the hairs, I'm loosely just pulling the brush towards myself in small layers. So lots of little lines in a row going down along the muscle instead of one long line across the whole thing, and doing that in multiple rows. When I'm painting the hairs, I try not to be too uniform, otherwise I feel it doesn't look real, and instead add a few X's. Not huge X's like the letter, but just some stray hairs that go the opposite direction. For the smaller muscles, I only do one row of the fine hairs, but I do make sure there's some room in between them so that a bit of that darker gray shows through. Can also be pretty hard to, with this one, when glued together, it was a bit difficult to get to all the areas on the leg here. And so in this one, I'm trying to angle it just so that I'm always pulling the brush towards myself, because I find that's the easiest way to end with the fine point and begin with the fine point, is to be dragging it towards myself and keeping the brush almost flat to the model when I can. I'm also not too worried if I end up messing up a few hairs and making them too thick, like I did here, because this is the base layer of fur and it will get a few more after this. A lot of those hairs will be hidden up by brighter hairs later on. This is also a very veiny boy, and so as I'm painting the hairs, I also take a second to highlight these veins that are kind of popping out of his muscles, and then paint hairs around them. For the actual fur on the model itself, I want to keep the same effect going, and so I'm again making thin lines where possible and just dragging the brush towards me. I do use the edge of the brush a few times on the very thin hairs that are already there, but when it comes to the thicker ones, like on the paw pad here, I do try and keep my lines thin like they were on the rest of the muscle, just to keep things in line for how they look all over. Here's a good place you can see it, where I put 1 or 2 strands on each piece of sculpted fur. Moving on up in color now, I'm just adding a little bit of white, keeping it thin like I did the last time, but just having a little bit brighter shade. Now, not too bright though. This This is meant to be black, and so I want to keep these subtle. And so I'm using the texture to kind of draw out the detail rather than just going to a brighter white. Now, if you think of his muscle like a ball with a light shining on it, I'm trying to paint these lighter hairs in the areas where that light would hit. So the idea is I use the texture in order to create the highlights so that there's still the highlights there in the place that you would expect them, except that they're done with texture in a fur texture instead. Usually the light, I like to make it from front left on the model. So that's why I'm keeping the ones on this side closer to the front of the muscle. Because these muscles on the inside of the leg are exposed to a bit more light than the ones on the back, because again my light source is coming into his front like this, I had just a bit more area to those highlights. When I'm highlighting the actual fur, I want to make sure to follow the curve of the muscle that would be behind it. So that's why I'm highlighting this upper part here instead of the lower part, which I would naturally kind of assume would be the highlight point. On to the final highlight. This one is still what I would probably call just a 50-50 mix of black-white with that little bit of orange in there. So still not too bright, but against these darker colors will show up quite bright. And with this, I'm just detailing the lightest points of the muscles. So it's not a huge area, just a small one. And so I keep my strokes quite tight and small, but still making sure that I'm making that fur pattern. And that'll give me the light highlights that you would see from a natural curve like that. Onto the darkening of the model now. So for this I'm using a larger brush, a Green Stuff World Gold 2, because it'll handle more of the thinner in its bristles. So I take some of the thinner, wick out a little bit on the paper towel there, and then just dab the tip into the black paint that I have mixed with some of the orange to make it brown. Using this, I will start with where I put that tip of paint. I will put that into the deepest recesses of the model, and then using the rest of the thinner that was on the brush, spread it out over the large area. The reason I want to do this is to blend those furs a little bit better into the darker shades. When you look over it, you can see all that texture is there, but it should still dim when you're getting into the shadows. So this is making those shadows by going backwards, so going darker instead of light like I was before. And here you can see why it's important to make sure your brush is damp enough. So my bristles started splitting there because it wasn't wet enough. And then as soon as I get it wet by the palette and then put a bit more paint on, you can see it coats nice and evenly. Then I just draw it out of the pool that I started with. These kind of thin layers would be possible with the airbrush as well, and that's how I normally would do it. But I did want to show you guys that it's completely possible to do without an airbrush as well. Switching back to my fine liner here, so what I'm going to do is some actual black lining, and so for this it's just straight black with a bit of thinner to make sure that it comes off my brush easily, and also to make it a little bit translucent. And I'm just starting in between the muscles here, making sure that they're kind of defined and separately. And you can see I'm also trying to make little hair marks, and so this will keep that texture going and not just be a straight line in one direction, and should hopefully blend out the work that I did earlier. For the actual hairs, I paint in between them just to define them each separately, And then where this was most important was along the veins. And so by black lining underneath them where the shadows would be, they'll be much easier to see among the dark gray. While I'm doing this, I'm always looking for somewhere to add texture. So here in the darkest recess of the muscle on the backside away from the light, I'm adding little hair strands like I would have before, but this time just using the black. Now this is the brightest I'm going to be going with this, so I add a little bit more white to my 50-50 that I had before. And what I'm using with this is it's to sell the effect. I'm just putting rogue strands of hair. The best way you want to think of it is like when you look at an animal that has fur, there's always different color hairs among the fur. And so these little streaks of almost white show that irregularity you would find in a fur pattern. And of course this is possible to do with sculpted fur as well, just adding a bit of different color or a lighter color among the strands. Now I did make a mistake here and I made that one strand on the leg a little too big, so I went back with my darker colors and just went over it again with more hairs along the sides of it, and then eventually when I got it back to where I wanted, just added that little streak right here. Easy fix. To finalize it, I did think the back of the leg was still a bit too bright for being in the shadows of where I wanted my light source to be, so I'm just adding a bit more of these black washes on the back side of the leg in order to make it a little bit darker. And I do that by adding the paint a little bit more thickly this time, and then rinsing off my brush and wetting it out, and then dragging it from those wet pools of paint. Now I've done this effect before with dark brown fur, light brown fur, blonde fur even, and even a kind of a blue on white fur, which was fun to do, but I've never done it with a black fur. And the reason I had to do the black fur this time is because this was a commission piece and the commissioner wanted black fur. And so what I learned doing this is that in order to get to black, you actually need to go a bit lighter first. And that way your black shadows have something to contrast against without going too light to make it seem like gray or white fur either. Painting fur is probably one of my favorite things to paint nowadays because it doesn't actually take a lot of work, even though it looks like it took you a lot of work. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey today, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe because I'll be uploading as often as possible.